I stood in the hallway of our Westport home, still wearing my coat, my purse hanging heavily from my shoulder as I stared at the dead Valentine's flowers sitting on the kitchen island. The roses were wrapped in thick, cream-colored paper and tied with a red satin ribbon, the exact kind of dramatic arrangement my husband always said he loved because it felt traditional. I had bought them myself just a few hours earlier from a small flower shop near the train station, completely unaware that my entire life was about to fall apart. Tucked inside the handmade card were 2 first-class tickets to Paris. We were supposed to leave Friday evening, and I had planned the trip as a surprise after weeks of noticing how distant he had become. I had imagined his face lighting up when he discovered the tickets, but by noon, I had already seen that same face while he was kissing another woman. The doorbell rang again, longer and louder this time, followed by the muffled sound of my husband's voice coming through the heavy wooden door. "Emma, please open the door," he pleaded, his voice breaking with a desperation I had never heard from him before. I looked down at my phone as another call appeared on the screen, showing the old photograph of him wearing a navy sweater, a picture I had never bothered to change. It was taken during our early years together, before the gray appeared at his temples, before the custom-made suits, and before his unchecked ambition slowly turned into a sense of entitlement. I let the phone continue ringing in the quiet house, suddenly realizing how incredibly small his words sounded after the spectacle I had witnessed only hours earlier. At exactly 11:40 that morning, I had walked into the bright, polished concrete lobby of Harlow Reed Technologies, carrying that bouquet of roses. The building was a masterpiece of glass, steel, and living green walls, a corporate headquarters I rarely visited anymore because my husband had gradually trained everyone around him to see it as his private world. I expected someone to recognize me, perhaps one of the original employees who remembered when we were only 12 people working out of a rented room above a dental clinic. Instead, the new receptionist barely looked away from her computer screen. She smiled brightly and asked whether I was there for the big celebration. I gave her a faint smile, assuming my husband had organized some kind of Valentine's Day event for the staff, and continued toward the crowded atrium. I heard the thunderous applause before I could even see what was happening. More than 200 employees were gathered around a raised platform. The stage was covered with white roses and gold balloons, a violinist played softly in one corner, and the company logo glowed above the crowd. Standing in the center was Amanda Blake, the brilliant young CEO my husband had hired 18 months earlier. She looked completely polished and composed. My husband stood beside her wearing the practiced smile he always used in front of investors and employees. Then, without warning, he dropped to one knee and opened a velvet ring box. The enormous diamond caught the light as the crowd erupted into cheers. He slipped the ring onto Amanda's finger and kissed her passionately. There was nothing accidental about it. It wasn't confusion or some misunderstanding. A man doesn't kiss another woman like that unless he has rehearsed the betrayal long before anyone else sees it. A woman standing near me whispered that they looked perfect together. That one word seemed to slice straight through the noise. Perfect! My husband suddenly looked across the room, and his eyes found mine. His carefully practiced smile disappeared instantly, and the color drained from his face when he realized I had witnessed everything. Still, he didn't step down from the stage. He didn't call my name. He didn't even move toward me. Amanda simply turned in my direction with polite confusion and quietly asked whether we knew each other. In that agonizing moment, I understood something far more painful than the affair itself. My husband had not simply betrayed me, he had erased me from the life he had built around himself. I turned around and walked out of the building before I allowed anyone to see my dignity completely break. I could have fallen apart right there in front of a room full of strangers. The clueless receptionist smiled warmly and wished me a wonderful Valentine's Day. I hurried past her toward the elevator, and once I was safely inside my car, my hands began shaking uncontrollably as I stared at the useless flowers and the Paris tickets lying on the passenger seat. I could have marched back inside, thrown the roses directly at his face, and created the dramatic scene everyone in that office was probably expecting. Instead, my anger turned cold and strangely calm. I pulled out my phone, canceled the vacation, and immediately called our bank to freeze every joint account we shared. Then I called our longtime attorney, Martin Keller, the man who had handled my family's legal affairs since my father was still alive. When I calmly told him that my husband had just gotten engaged to his own CEO, there was complete silence on the other end of the line. I instructed him to bypass the ordinary accounts and immediately withdraw the company's full available position from Harlow Reed Technology. Martin warned me that pulling my 83% stake would trigger a massive capital event and could instantly freeze the company's credit line. I pressed my thumb firmly against the steering wheel until the pressure became painful and told him to execute the order immediately. At that point, I honestly didn't care how much chaos it created. By the time I drove back to our house, my phone had been buzzing almost nonstop. I had more than 150 missed calls. Now my husband was standing on my front porch, repeatedly pressing the doorbell like a desperate man trying to wake someone from the dead. Sweat had soaked through parts of his expensive suit. I walked toward the front window and saw his luxury company car sitting at a careless angle across the driveway, apparently abandoned in his panic. When I finally opened the door halfway, his eyes moved quickly from my expression to the dead flowers sitting on the kitchen counter behind me. He lowered his voice and said that the situation wasn't what it appeared to be, completely unaware that his carefully protected business empire was already beginning to collapse. I calmly asked him what, exactly, it was supposed to look like. Before he could give me an answer, his own phone started ringing. He glanced down at the screen, and the sudden horror that appeared across his face told me everything I needed to know. He didn't have to say a single word. I knew the board of directors had discovered the financial freeze. And for the first time that day, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction watching his perfect composure finally crumble. He quickly silenced the phone and begged me to let him come inside so we could discuss everything privately. He was terrified that the neighbors might see him standing there, begging on my porch, because a public scandal didn't fit the polished image he had spent years carefully building. When he insisted that he had simply made a mistake, I reminded him that forgetting an anniversary was a mistake. Proposing to your coworker was a decision. His jaw tightened as he muttered that the entire situation had somehow gotten out of control. He had always possessed that particular talent for making his own disasters sound like unexpected weather. His phone buzzed again, this time with Martin's name on the screen, and the realization of what I had done finally transformed his panic into calculation. He angrily told me that I couldn't simply pull company capital because there were corporate clauses and legal obligations protecting the business. I reminded him that he was the one who had signed those exact clauses 14 years earlier, back when Harlow Re Technologies was nothing more than an ambitious dream. Back then, we had been a perfect team. He had the charisma and sales ability to win over investors, and I had the architectural talent to build the software. My father had been the primary investor because he trusted my abilities and believed in what I was creating. After he passed away, those shares were transferred into our family holding company. My husband had convinced me to remain out of the public spotlight, telling me that investors preferred having one clear operational voice. I agreed because I had always believed that marriage wasn't supposed to be a competition. He knew exactly who legally owned the company, but somewhere along the way, he had confused being the public face of the business with actually owning it. He tried to soften his voice, telling me that I had every right to be angry. I simply looked at him and said I had every right to know that my husband had been living as though he were a single man. He immediately flinched and claimed that Amanda had no idea about the truth of our marriage because he had told her we were separated. The revelation moved through me like ice. I couldn't stop thinking about the innocent confusion on her face in the atrium when she had looked at me during the proposal. He admitted that he had told her our marriage was already over, even though he had continued sleeping in my bed every night and spending holidays with my family as if nothing had changed. He desperately insisted that the board was simply overreacting and that the entire situation could still be controlled. His words made one thing painfully clear: he was worried about damage control, not about what he had done to me. I reached for the black envelope sitting on the table and told him that the Paris tickets inside had been meant to surprise him and repair the distance that had been growing between us. For a moment, he looked genuinely hurt. Then his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Martin, and I deliberately turned the screen so he could read it. The message said an emergency board meeting had been scheduled for 7:30, and the board was requesting my presence by video conference. My husband ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking much older than he had only hours earlier. He warned me that removing him from the company could destabilize everything and hurt hundreds of employees. I told him that the well-being of those employees should have mattered to him before he transformed his office into an engagement celebration. When I asked whether Amanda knew the truth now, his heavy silence gave me all the confirmation I needed. I started closing the door. He suddenly asked if I was really going to divorce him. After years of silent humiliations, the answer came surprisingly easily. I told him yes. Then he asked what would happen to Harlow Reed. I looked directly into his eyes and told him that the company had never truly belonged to him. I closed the door, locked it, and watched through the window as he walked slowly toward his car and dropped his face into his. At exactly 7:30, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water in front of me, watching the nervous faces of the board members appear across my laptop screen. My husband joined the meeting from his dark executive office, and for the first time, everyone on that call seemed to understand that the woman they had spent years overlooking was actually the person with the power to determine what happened next. The meeting opened with an uncomfortable silence before the chairman carefully confirmed that my family's holding company had officially withdrawn its enormous equity commitment. Every eye on the screen remained fixed on me as I confirmed that the legal notice was valid. With those few words, the illusion of my husband's complete control finally collapsed. He tried to plead with me during the call, asking me not to make permanent decisions based on what he described as temporary emotions. I remained calm and completely unmoved. The board quickly shifted its attention toward his serious compliance violations, particularly the fact that he had concealed his marriage while pursuing a highly public relationship with a senior executive. Before the hour was over, the general counsel recommended placing him on immediate administrative leave, effectively stripping him of his authority. The following morning, the house felt strangely different without him, and yet watching the neighborhood children gather for the school bus brought me back to reality. Martin arrived at my home carrying several thick folders and explained that the banks had officially suspended the company's acquisition financing because of the sudden instability. The lenders wanted to know whether I intended to reinvest after a complete restructuring of the executive leadership. I told Martin the truth. I still believed in the software I had spent my youth creating. Real revenge didn't mean destroying everything I had built just because the person beside me had betrayed me. It meant refusing to allow a thief to take credit for my work. Later that afternoon, Amanda called my personal phone. Her voice sounded fragile and uncertain compared with the confident corporate persona I had always seen at work. Through tears, she explained that my husband had even rented a secret apartment downtown to convince her that he was genuinely living separately from me. Hearing the sincerity in her voice made me realize that Amanda had been another victim of the elaborate web of lies he had created. Before we ended the call, she quietly asked whether I could ever forgive her. I told her honestly that I didn't know her well enough to offer forgiveness. But I also knew something else for certain. I was finally free from his manipulation. As I looked down at the corporate restructuring documents spread across my desk, I realized I was ready to step out of the shadows, take responsibility for what I had built, and finally claim the company that had always belonged to me.